My opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will, and the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no, and they'll push, and I'll say no, and they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
It was the promise that turned the tide around for a candidate in an election. It was the promise that at the time would be a main pillar of a presidency that was marketed as a continuation of the prosperous Reagan years, a continuation of the Reagan Revolution. Instead, it would be the downfall of an administration and a main factor into an electoral loss that would lead to a new era of American politics. When George Herbert Walker Bush made that infamous remark, it was considered a major moment in the 1988 presidential election, where he would climb from a large deficit to win in an electoral landslide, albeit smaller than those of his old boss. Today, this promise remains in political infamy as an example of a political promise that would not only be unfulfilled, but a promise that would be broken. Promise that is still talked about 38 years since the moment it happened. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Read My Lips, the promise that doomed a presidency. The year is 1988. It's presidential election season. Vice President George H.W. Bush has secured the Republican nomination for president, despite multiple primary challengers, most notably including U.S. Senator Robert Dole of Kansas, televangelist and chair of the Christian Broadcasting Network Pat Robertson, and New York Congressman Jack Kemp. On the Democratic side of things, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis had won the Democratic nomination despite a dense field of challengers, most notably including Senators Paul Simon of Illinois, Albert Gore of Tennessee, and civil rights activist Reverend Jesse Jackson. Early polling was showing that Vice President Bush was in serious trouble, as it showed Governor Dukakis leading by pretty big margins, with the largest lead coming from a Gallup poll taken from July 21st to the 22nd, showing Dukakis with a 17-point lead, with him at 55% compared to Vice President Bush's 38%. With those numbers, it was clear to the Bush campaign that something needed to be done to shake up the race and to turn the tide back in favor of the vice president. With that in mind, they decided to go for an issue that Americans would be passionate about: taxes. Taxes had been an important issue for the country, especially in 1986 when the race to see who would succeed incumbent President Ronald Reagan heated up. An organization named Americans for Tax Reform had created a No New Taxes pledge, and were going around asking Republican candidates to sign the pledge. Many candidates agreed to sign it, including two of Bush's primary opponents, those being the aforementioned Jack Kemp and former Delaware Governor Pete DuPont. Vice President Bush initially declined to sign the pledge, but ended up signing it the next year, in 1987. By the time the 1988 Republican National Convention in New Orleans was on the horizon, Bush had secured the nomination, but the campaign was looking for something that could unite the party, as conservatives didn't really trust Bush since he was a more moderate Republican, and therefore weren't really enthusiastic for his campaign. The Bush camp then decided to focus on the issue of taxes as a way to generate enthusiasm from conservatives, or in the words of James Pinkerton, an advisor to the vice president, focusing on taxes, quote, unified the right and didn't antagonize anybody else. So the idea of a clear no new taxes pledge was starting to be pitched around by campaign staff. The premise of the idea was taken from Jack Kemp, with the actual pledge being written by speechwriter and political columnist Peggy Noonan. However, there was internal debate if the written pledge should actually be included in Bush's nomination acceptance speech. Some within the campaign and the vice president's team didn't want the pledge to be on the speech, with the most prominent critic being Richard Darman, an economic advisor to Vice President Bush, who called the pledge, quote, stupid and dangerous. However, the pledge was kept in the speech at the insistence of other allies to Bush, including television executive and media consultant Roger Ailes, as they believed that the pledge of no new taxes would brush up support among conservatives in a campaign that was trying to align itself more to the center. Thus, on the 18th of August, 1988, one of the most infamous political pledges in American history would be made. During the final day of the Republican National Convention, Vice President Bush said, quote, and I'm the one who will not raise taxes. My opponent now says that he'll raise them as a last resort, or a third resort. But when a politician talks like that, you know that's one resort he'll be checking into. My opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will. Then, as they say, the rest is history.
And the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no. And they'll push, and I'll say no. And they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
After the pledge was made, the Bush campaign would begin to climb back into the lead for the general election campaign. In the week after the RNC, a Gallup poll would show Bush leading Dukakis by 4%, with Bush having 48%, while Dukakis had only 44%. The vice president's favorabilities also increased significantly following the pledge. This pledge and subsequent surge in the polls would redefine the election, with other factors such as the skills of Lee Atwater, Bush's campaign manager and ADA and a political consultant, and the many stumbles and gaffes Michael Dukakis himself would allow for the Bush campaign to soar to a major victory. When the polls closed, it would indeed be a major win. On November 8, Vice President Bush would defeat Governor Dukakis in a landslide. Bush received 426 electoral votes and 53.4% of the popular vote. Dukakis only received 111 electoral votes and 45.7% of the popular vote. A faithless elector from West Virginia subsequently ended up voting for Dukakis' running mate, Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen. When Bush came into office, it would seem at first that his promise of no new taxes would hold up. But the promise that redefined an election would also end up being the promise that would doom his administration, and subsequently end his political career. By the time now President Bush's term began in 1989, it was proving to be difficult for the 41st president to keep his promise of no new taxes for multiple reasons, but especially for two main reasons. The first reason was that he was working with a Democratic-controlled Congress throughout his term. In the same year Bush won his term as president, the Democratic Party made some minor gains in Congress. In the Senate, the Democrats, led by West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd, had a 55-seat majority in the chamber, while the Republicans, led by the aforementioned Robert Dole, had only 45 seats. In the House of Representatives, the Democrats, led by House Speaker Jim Wright from Texas, had a majority in the chamber with 260 seats, while the Republicans, led by House Minority Leader Bob Michel of Illinois, had only 175 seats in the chamber. The second reason was that the pledge was made on the basis of economic numbers produced by the campaign that assumed that the economic growth that was seen in the Reagan years would just continue, and that the economy would just keep on growing during Bush's presidency. However, that would not come to pass, as instead a recession would hit the United States and much of the Western world for much of the early 1990s, with economic growth being sluggish and slow in the aftermath, and this would end up hurting the incumbent president. When 1990 came, the country's deficit was rising due to multiple factors, including increased spending, an economy that was declining, and piling budget deficits. When the deficit kept growing, a 1985 law known as the Graham-Rudman-Hollins Balanced Budget Act mandated that in situations like these, either steps would be taken to reduce the deficit, or deep spending cuts unpopular among both political parties would have to be done, causing the task of reducing the nation's deficit to be difficult. In short, if no other steps were taken, deep spending cuts would have to occur in three major spending areas. Those three areas were defense, Medicare, and Social Security. The first one was a no-touching zone for Republicans, while the other two were no-touching zones for the Democrats. When time came to negotiate on a budget for the 1990-91 fiscal year, it would prove to be quite the challenge during the situation. President Bush first proposed a budget that included sweeping spending cuts, but no tax increases, but congressional Democrats dismissed the proposal. Then came time for negotiations, but it was soon made clear that without a compromise being reached when it came to tax increases, no progress would be made. Subsequently, Richard Darman, now head of the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, and John H. Sununu, Bush's chief of staff, both felt like such a tax compromise was necessary to pass a budget. Other Republicans would go on to endorse a compromise on tax increases, such as former President Gerald Ford, former Tennessee Governor Lamar Alexander, and former OMB Director Paul O'Neill. On June 27, President Bush released a statement saying that the deficit is indeed becoming a problem and that a package with a variety of solutions would have to be included. According to the statement, this included reform to the budget process, incentives for economic growth, minor spending cuts, and most importantly, tax revenue increases, or in layman's terms, higher taxes. Essentially, President Bush, the man who said, "Read my lips, no new taxes" 2 years back, is now saying that more new taxes are up for negotiation. This sparked anger among conservatives and other people, with a New York Post headline the next day saying, quote, "Read my lips, I lied." However, some reportedly tried to defend the president, saying that the term tax revenue increases did not really mean higher taxes, and that it could have other meanings, such as the increase in the percentage of one's income that can be taxable. However, Bush himself would later confirm that tax increases were indeed on the table. Other prominent Republicans were also angry with Bush's reversal when it came to taxes, including prominent Senate Republicans, House Minority Whip Newt Gingrich, and even Dan Quayle, Bush's second-in-command as the vice president. This is because of two main reasons. First, they believed that President Bush had ruined the Republican Party's most prominent issue to run on for years, that being, of course, lower taxes. Secondly, it was also because apparently congressional Republican leadership wasn't even consulted on the upcoming budget deal that Bush was preparing to make, which also frankly pissed them off. Consequently, the reversal, lack of consultation for party leadership, and President Bush's perceived portrayal led to infighting within the Republican Party. When Chief of Staff John Sununu called Minority Whip Gingrich with the news of the imminent budget deal, Gingrich reportedly hung up on him out of anger. When Mississippi Senator Trent Lott questioned the reversal President Bush made on taxes, Sununu said in response, quote, "Trent Lott has become an insignificant figure in this process." Ed Rollins, co-chair of the Republican National Committee, later wrote a memo urging Republican candidates to distance themselves from Bush, stating, quote, "Do not hesitate to distance yourself from the president." In his book, Bare Knuckles and Back Rooms, My Life in American Politics, Rollins would later write, quote, "My job was electing Republicans to the House. George Bush and his tax deal made that impossible. Now my job was to see how many we could save. Guys who didn't think they had a race were all of a sudden fighting for their lives, including Newt Gingrich." Rollins would subsequently resign from his post not long after. When it came to voting on the budget deal, now known as the 1990 Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, Newt Gingrich, who was against Bush's reversal from the start, would work to rally conservative Republicans against the proposal in order to tank the bill. Despite it passing in the House by a vote of 228 by 200, Gingrich would manage to convince over 100 Republicans to vote against the legislation, making him a hero and the darling to the conservative wing of the GOP. And it would be the first of many stepping stones that led to the 1994 Republican Revolution. Nevertheless, the Budget Act would pass the Senate as well, and the legislation would be signed into law by President Bush on November 5th, 1990. This bill, among other provisions, would increase multiple taxes. For example, it would increase the maximum individual income tax rate by 3 points, going from 28% to 31%. This bill also increased the alternative minimum tax rate by 3 points, going from 21% to 24%. Other taxes would be increased in this piece of legislation, such as the payroll tax and the excise tax. In the wake of all the reversals, infighting, and disunity within the Republican Party, it would affect the party and President Bush's popularity in a negative way. Let's start with the approval rating. In early 1989, Bush's approval rating was already very high, at 79%. However, thanks to his reversal on taxes and the subsequent outrage, his approval rating would fall to 56% by October of 1990, which is still a positive approval rating, but much lower compared to the year before. The Republicans would also take a pretty big hit in the 1990 midterm elections, which were held a day after the Budget Act was signed, on November the 6th. In the House, the Democrats, now led by House Speaker Tom Foley of Washington State, gained 7 seats to have a majority in the chamber with 267 seats. The Republicans, still led by Bob Michel, lost 8 seats, going down to just 167 seats in the chamber. An independent candidate would also win election to the House, a certain guy from Vermont named Bernie Sanders. You might have heard of him. In the Senate, the Democrats, now led by Maine Senator George Mitchell, gained only 1 seat, that being Minnesota, to have a majority in that chamber with 56 seats. The Republicans, still led by Robert Dole of Kansas, won a relatively reduced minority in the Senate, with only 44 seats. However, President Bush's fortunes would soon be reversed temporarily, as Operation Desert Storm, the second portion of the wider Gulf War, would prove to be a smashing success. The war stemmed from the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein's invasion and takeover of Kuwait, and in just 6 weeks, Hussein would surrender, and Kuwait would be liberated. With how quick the war was, and how lopsided it was, with the casualties being 242 soldiers from the US-led coalition compared to up to 50,000 Iraqi soldiers, Bush's approval ratings would subsequently soar. In October of 1990, his approval rating was at 56%. In just a few months, by February of 1991, it would surge to a record high of 89%, the highest for an incumbent president ever at the time, now succeeded by his son, a decade later. Those fortunes would soon change, however, as the effects from the successful Gulf War would soon wear off. And soon enough, President Bush was politically in the thick of it, as critics within his own party and from the Democratic Party would soon go after him over many things, but most primarily, breaking his pledge to not raise taxes. The first person to take advantage of it politically was Pat Buchanan, a political commentator who had experience working in the White Houses of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. On the day he entered the race for president in the Republican primary, December 11, 1991, one of his main reasons for entering the race for president was, quote, because we Republicans can no longer say it is all the liberals' fault. It was not some liberal Democrat who said, read my lips, no new taxes, then broke his word to cut a seedy backroom budget deal with the big spenders on Capitol Hill. Buchanan would heavily focus on Bush's broken promise in the New Hampshire GOP primary, repeating the phrase over and over again in commercials, both television and radio, and his efforts seemed to have paid off. Although President Bush won the primary, Buchanan would manage to narrow their margin substantially, with him receiving 37.5% of the popular vote, an impressive showing for a primary challenger to a sitting president. When it came to President Bush, he at first tried to defend his reversal on taxes, saying that the reversal was essential due to how the economy was doing, which was not very good, and so those tax increases were necessary to further grow the economy. Some polling reportedly showed that while Americans did agree that some tax hikes were necessary, it was more so a problem that President Bush broke his promise of no new taxes, and his reversal caused Americans to lose trust and respect in his administration. Then, he switched to apologizing for his reversal, first stating in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, quote, I did it, and I regret it, and regret it. However, the president's apologies proved to be ineffective, and his reversal would prove to be his Achilles heel throughout the campaign. President Bush would go on to win the Republican primary, but would prove to face an even tougher time in the general election. He would be put up against Bill Clinton, the then Democratic governor of Arkansas at the time. While Clinton would have scandals of his own, closely related to his alleged sexual relations with other women, polling had shown that when it came to integrity, they both saw Governor Clinton and President Bush similarly when it came to the issue. The Clinton campaign would focus hard on Bush's reversal on taxes, with an ad designed by James Carville, a well-known campaign strategist and political pundit, proving to be quite effective. And after some digging, I believe that it was this ad that I will show here.
The George Bush Promise.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
Then he gave us the second biggest tax increase in American history. Bush increased the gas tax by 56%. Can we afford 4 more years? Bill Clinton, a different kind of Democrat. As governor, Arkansas has the second lowest tax burden in the country, balanced 12 budgets. You don't have to read his lips, read his record. Clinton Gore, for people, for a change.
The reversal would continue to hurt President Bush as the general election campaign continued on as the summer turned into fall, and it would continue to hurt his campaign. It also wouldn't help that by mid to late 1992, his approval rating had collapsed from its record high, now generally sitting in the high 30s to low 40s, with it at one point sinking below 30%, which is nothing short of disastrous for the incumbent president. It also didn't help that Ross Perot, a billionaire businessman from Texas, was running a shockingly successful independent campaign for president, even after dropping out and coming back in, with his polling generally in the high teens to low 20s, further hampering Bush's campaign and Clinton's to an extent. With those factors, the low approval rating, his reversal on taxes, the insurgent Perot campaign, the soaring Clinton campaign, and many more, President Bush was essentially doomed. On election night 1992, Governor Clinton would defeat President Bush in a landslide. Clinton would receive 370 electoral votes and 43% of the popular votes. President Bush would only receive 168 electoral votes and 37.5% of the popular vote. Ross Perot, while receiving no electoral votes, would receive 18.9% of the popular vote, which is the second highest vote share total for a third-party campaign ever in American history, only beaten by Theodore Roosevelt's bid for president in 1912. With that, the Bush presidency was over, and on January 20th, 1993, William Jefferson Clinton would be sworn in as the 42nd president, beginning a new era of American politics. The legacy that the No New Taxes pledge has left on American politics is one where the promise acts as both a warning of what not to say during a campaign, and how one promise can end up sinking a presidential administration and the political career of one man. Many officials who worked in both the Reagan and Bush administrations share this viewpoint when it comes to the late 41st president's infamous pledge. Richard Wirthlin, a chief political strategist for President Reagan, called the pledge, quote, the 6 most destructive words in the history of presidential politics. Former RNC co-chair Ed Rollins said that the pledge and subsequent reversal was, quote, probably the most serious violation of any political pledge anybody has ever made. Marlin Fitzwater, the White House press secretary for Presidents Reagan and Bush, called the reversal of the pledge the, quote, single biggest mistake of the administration. However, others disagree with his view of the pledge. Richard Wirthlin, the aforementioned OMB director, said that he didn't believe that the reversal of the No New Taxes pledge did not play any major role in President Bush's downfall and defeat in the 1992 election. Other figures would also argue that while the reversal was indeed politically perilous for President Bush, it was done for the good of the United States. This pledge would be invoked or referred to numerous times in the following years. In 2000, George W. Bush, then governor of Texas and son of the 41st president, was answering a question on economic matters and made a reference to taxes during a Republican presidential primary debate in New Hampshire. A reporter for the Manchester Union Leader, a man named John Mephisto, asked the then governor, quote, is this no new taxes so help me God? Bush Jr. would respond with, quote, this is not only no new taxes, this is a tax cut so help me God. Governor Bush would go on to win the Republican primary, that November's general election, and would go on to serve 2 terms as the 43rd president. This pledge would be invoked internationally on 2 occasions, both in the British Isles. In Ireland, in 2009, Brian Lenihan Jr., the country's finance minister at the time, promised to not raise taxes in the 2010 budget, which was presented in December of that year, declaring, quote, read my lips, no tax hikes. Mr. Lenihan would indeed keep his promise, but it would come at the cost of pay cuts for public sector employees and cuts to social welfare programs, due to Ireland dealing with economic turmoil at the time. A decade later, in the United Kingdom ahead of the 2019 general election, Boris Johnson, the country's prime minister at the time, promised during the campaign that he would not raise taxes, saying, quote, read my lips, we will not be raising taxes. Unlike President Bush, however, Johnson named 3 specific taxes that would not be raised, those being the income tax, the value-added tax, and the national insurance contributions tax. Johnson and his Conservative Party would go on to win the election with a majority in Parliament, but like President Bush before him, he would go on to reverse his pledge, and in 2021, Parliament would pass the 2021 Health and Social Care Levy Act, in which the national insurance, or NI, contributions tax would rise by 1.25%, in order to raise billions of pounds to improve the country's social care to tackle a backlog of patients waiting for treatment in hospitals in wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Regardless of your view of this infamous pledge and George H.W. Bush's later reversal, there is no denying that this pledge has gone down in the history books, for better or worse, as one of the most well-known political soundbites in American history, made by a candidate whose goal was to unite their political party behind them, but would later end up coming back to bite them, and would end up causing them, their political party, and their administration, their popularity, and a national election. I hope this video helped you learn more about this promise, how it came to be, and how it ended up being the major thorn of a side of a presidency. And with that, thank you for watching.